Hello, everyone. My name is Osiris Sinuhé González Romero. I am very glad to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Currently, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of History of Medicine, and I am glad to share with you some of the outputs of my research regarding psychedelics. My focus, I have a background in philosophy and Mesoamerican studies, and I'm trying to develop a philosophical approach trying to encourage and to explain the philosophical uses of psychedelics among other issues. To begin with this analysis, it is necessary to highlight the primary uses of psychedelics, which the scientific literature recognizes mainly. This is really important because we tend to overlap the different uses and the different meaning. And we use, for example, to state some criteria from one use to another, and this causes some misunderstandings. According to scientific literature, for example, the main uses of psychedelics have been therapeutic uses, ritual and religious uses, creative uses, hedonistic or adult uses, or recreative, it's another form, but it's contested also. And this research clarified the scope of 5 philosophical uses. A philosophical approach considers that the psychedelic experience is a source of knowledge, not only a series of hallucinations. This is the first step to develop, according to my point of view. There are different philosophical approaches, but that the psychedelic experience is a source of knowledge. It's a source of wisdom, right? What kind of knowledge? Well, this workshop and the research, it's an attempt to analyze this matter. But it is possible to talk about knowledge of the brain, knowledge of the self, and knowledge of the interaction between human beings and nature and society, because nature is a philosophical context, a philosophical concept, and it is possible to analyze the rise of the concept of nature through the Western tradition. Let's move forward.
Please, that's great.
Why cognitive liberty? Well, cognitive liberty, it's an update of the freedom of thought, the classic concept of freedom of thought, very well known within the liberal tradition, right? But the challenge of the neurotechnologies of 21st century require an update of this concept. The rise of neuroscience and the increase of technologies capable of affecting or monitoring cognition, such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, is one of the very well-known images produced in the Imperial College London, so on. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, brain implants, brain-machine interfaces, or the implementation of biochemistry and neuropsychopharmacology to enhance or modify the human cognition cause new philosophical dilemmas. By this reason, it's necessary to develop an update from a philosophical perspective. The development of neuroscience requires an update of our conception of freedom of thought to face that transformation successfully. By the reason, it's important to address this topic nowadays, because all these neurotechnologies represent challenge to the cognitive liberty, to the freedom of thought. Of course, it is possible, for example, to state, according to the very well-known friends of liberalism, the right to use, and the absence of interference, developed by John Stuart Mill, Isaiah Berlin, but also Timothy Leary developed a version of this topic 30 years before the concept of cognitive liberty was coined in a different approach. Well, this is only an example. Okay, this is only an example of this, technology that better than me, right? The next slide, please. Okay, this is the one of the outputs of my research, the cognitive liberty and the psychedelic humanities. This one paper recently published. And cognitive liberty is every person's fundamental right to think independently, use the full spectrum of his or her mind, and have autonomy over their brain chemistry. This is important because the politics of punishment, the politics of prohibition undermine this mental autonomy. We can return. No, this fundamental right implies some ethical issues, but the reason it's necessary to develop a philosophical approach, which are necessary to consider. For example, cognitive liberty concerns the ethics and legality of safeguarding one's own thought processes, and by necessity, one electrochemical brain states. The individual, not corporate and government interests, should have sole jurisdiction over the control and or modulation of his and her brain states and mental processes. This is the quote of one of the contemporary authors that address the issue of cognitive liberty, but there are several approaches, 5 or 6 different approaches, but mainly the approaches, of course, are not developed from a psychedelic perspective. They consider cognitive liberty, but unfortunately, they don't take into account the psychedelic experience and their research in the field. Okay, what does actually mean by the term cognitive liberty in the context of the psychedelic humanities? You know very well the work of Charlotte Walsh, who argues cognitive liberty is in one sense synonymous with freedom of thought, yet more precisely about the idea that this should be read to acknowledge the fact that individuals should have the right to autonomous self-determination over their right on brain chemistry, a right that is currently infringed by the prohibition of psychedelics. As you can appreciate, for example, in this approach, Charlotte Walsh focused on individual rights. But perhaps another hypothesis could be try to consider collective rights. It's very common to talk about psychedelic capitalism nowadays. I was in Denver, it was a paradigmatic example of this. Of course, there are different approaches and different ways, but it's not very common, for example, to talk about psychedelic socialism. It's strange, right? Or psychedelic anarchism, And also, freedom and liberty are related with these political ideologies. And of course, it's necessary to take into account some nuances. For example, psychedelic anarchists will be useful to fill some gaps left by psychedelic capitalism, right? The relevance of this research lies in analyzing a concept, liberty, that is considered the foundation of ethics and politics. This section aims to display a brief overview of the constitutive elements of cognitive liberty. An analytical approach is crucial to a better understanding of their contemporary significance, mainly because, according to Peter, philosophy and psychedelics helps expand consciousness. And recognize this statement is very useful, for example, to understand of the psychedelic experience outside of clinical settings. The expanse of consciousness, of course, is useful to achieve a broad overview. As is possible to see, there is a contemporary approach regarding cognitive liberty and mental autonomy, which has been taken up in psychedelic study during the 1st century by some scholars, such as Poiré, Walsh, and Davis. These 3 authors addressed the issue of cognitive liberty, but from a psychedelic perspective, right? Let's move. Okay, say self-contradictions. One important issue regarding cognitive liberty and a reflection on liberty is to address the contradictions. Following Hegel, everything is full of contradictions, and of course, psychedelic capitalism is full of them. And from a philosophical perspective, it's very fruitful to start analyzing these contradictions, right? The self-contradictions and ambiguities embedded in the concept of liberty, mainly implemented as a domination tool. This is one of the paradoxes of liberty. Most of times we tend to develop a naive approach of liberty, an idealization of liberty, and most of times we are not aware that the liberty and freedom are used as a mechanism of control, especially, for example, in the States. You know, it is possible to talk about an ideology of liberty, right? Mainly implemented as a domination tool, have undermined its legitimacy due to the failures and injustice caused by neoliberal and technocratic regimes. For example, libertarianism, another interpretation of freedom, reshaped the concept of liberal autonomy into consumer sovereignty, assuming that a free market society must prioritize medicalization, the interest of pharmaceutical companies, the opening of new markets, the rise of psychedelic seals. Now in Canada, it's a very well-known book called The Psychedelic Seal, right? And the wishes and expectation of consumers. One of the side effects of this degraded consumerist view of autonomy is the banalization or trivialization of the psychedelic experience, but also the paradoxical use of liberty as a mechanism of control. I want to make an analogy with the state of Hannah Arendt, when Hannah Arendt talk about the trivialization of evil, you know, after the trials of Nuremberg. In the case of psychedelic studies, it's possible to talk about a trivialization of the psychedelic experience. As a philosophers, as a researcher, we have to be aware of the trivialization of the psychedelic experience. Of course, there is not a recipe, you know, to detect that. But it's interesting, for example, within the rise of psychedelic capitalism, try to avoid the trivialization of psychedelic experience. Trivialization doesn't mean recognize ludic, creative, or hedonistic uses, because also hedonistic uses from a philosophical perspective are also stigmatized. You know, we are not reading Epicuro they're very well, but on the other hand, trivialization, it's another social phenomenon. And one example of this trivialization, you can find it in some videos in YouTube with some American teenagers smoking salvia divinorum, right? Doing crazy things. And due to this, salvia divinorum was not regulated. The authorities saw these videos and then start to regulate the substance. And on the other hand, for example, the legal psychedelic industry, the capitalism on drugs. In the previous slide, we saw, for example, an image of Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg. And it's interesting the case of Peter Thiel because he is backing, you know, with a lot of money, the psychedelic research. But Peter Thiel, a philosopher, German philosopher who studied at Stanford, he reshaped in a libertarian way to do it, the concept of liberty. And it's a paradox because he claims for liberty, but he received support from the CIA for his company, right? Another contradiction. Okay, to overcome some paradoxes and social contradiction attached to the psychedelic renaissance, it is necessary to reflect critically on liberty and update its meaning to the present needs. For instance, in the realm of psychedelic space, the significance of cognitive liberty related to consciousness. The right to control one's consciousness is the quintessence of freedom. If freedom is to mean anything, it must mean that each person has an inviolable right to think for him or herself. It must mean, at a minimum, that each person is free to direct one's own consciousness, underlying mental processes, beliefs, opinions, and worldview, according to Boyle, right? According to Foucault, the idea of control could be contested, right? But this is another step. Let's move with Boyle. Okay, let's move forward, Christine, please, with this, with the next. Slide. Okay. This is more or less a reinforcement of the previous argument, and as I previously stated, the connection between cognitive liberty and psychedelics could be summarized using the well-known frameworks of negative liberty developed by Mill, the absence of interference, and positive liberty coined by Isaiah Berlin. Regarding cognitive liberty, it's possible to talk about the right to refuse, absence of interference, or negative liberty, and the right to use, the enhancement of cognition, or positive liberty. There are two nuances regarding this topic. Let's move forward. The neuroenhancement is one of the critical traits advocated by psychedelic activism. A popular version of this topic was stated by Timothy Leary some decades before the term cognitive liberty was coined. The two commandments for the molecular age states. You shall not alter the consciousness of thy fellow man, as in the MK Ultra project, right? And you shall not prevent thy fellow man from altering his own consciousness. This is another version, or this is the popular psychedelic version of cognitive liberty, right? Summarizing, cognitive liberty involves at least 4 philosophical meanings: freedom of choice, freedom of religion, self-determination, and freedom of thought. These are the constitutive elements of cognitive liberty regarding psychedelic space. Each one has a specific implication in the field of psychedelic studies, which is necessary to explain to avoid misunderstanding and have the generalization. In the following, I will explain each one briefly to provide some examples. Let's move forward. For example, freedom of choice is related with dilemma. The dilemma is a philosophical, a philosophical topic. The right choice between A and B. This is a crucial aspect of freedom of choice. If you don't have freedom of choice, and of course, it's important to address from a philosophical perspective. It's a dilemma. And in our daily life, we face multiple dilemmas. And the dilemmas are full of, subjective, emotional, and social issues embedded on it. Freedom of choice goes beyond the therapeutic uses of psychedelics. Also, it involves the development of human faculties, the enhancement of cognitive skills, the achievement of psychological insights, and gender issues. For example, choosing one's gender or identity. It's very important because also, as you will know, as you know, for example, it's a rise movement of queering psychedelics, which requires, for example, special or different frameworks than usual. Let's move forward. This is a really interesting quote from Saskatchewan, right? Regarding autonomy and freedom of choices. And I highlight this quote because it's really profound. From the skin inward is my jurisdiction. Is it not? I choose what may or may not cross that border. Here, I am the custom agent. I am the coast guard. I am the sole legal and spiritual government of this territory, and only the laws I choose to enact within myself are applicable. What I think, where I focus my awareness, what biochemical reaction I choose to cause within the territorial boundaries of my own skins are not subject to the beliefs, morals, laws, or preference of any other person. I am a sovereign state, and I feel that my borders are more sacred than the politically drawn boundaries of any country. Of course, we can address critically this analogy between the self-boundaries and the boundaries of a country, right? But I guess that Saskatchewan is a perfect example of this freedom of choice, of this mental autonomy. This is one example. Let's move. Freedom of religion. This is another example. This is a photo took by the book of Joseph Calabrese, based in London, and he developed a really good work on cross-cultural healing with the Navajo people in the States and the rise of the Native American church. Of course, also the role of the Native American church is controversial, for example, due to the over-harvesting of peyote, For example, the vast majority of peyote comes from Mexico. Not the peyote that grows in the south of Texas, it's not enough to supply the needs of the Native American church with at least 600,000, members, right? Ritual and spiritual uses of psychedelics are at the core of the so-called psychedelic renaissance, mainly in areas such as anthropology and the history of religions. Both disciplines have contributed to a better understanding of ritual uses in ancient culture, the spirituality of indigenous peoples, and New Age reinterpretation. In the States, freedom of religion is one of the critical features of the so-called psychedelic research revival, mainly due to the implementation in the USA of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This amendment has been very influential because it allows some exemption from the general rule, and mainly because it represents a chink in the armor of prohibition policies. A very well-known examples in the USA are the Native American churches, some ayahuasca churches such as União do Vegetal, sorry for my bad Portuguese, Santo Daime Church, and the Rastafari religions. There are some examples, of course. Each one requires an analysis, a special analysis, to understand better the cultural framework of these movements. But on the other hand, it's not very common to talk about atheism within the psychedelic sphere. And it's interesting because a bunch of research in the psychedelic space take into account, mysticism, history of religion, and so on. But in a broad sense, freedom of religion not, and it's necessary to take into account. Why I state this? Because I found, for example, some news in the press that say, oh, after a session of psilocybin mushrooms, I have been cured for my atheism, right? Consider atheism, as a sickness. As 30 years ago, for example, the conversion therapies were considered a mental health issue. Unfortunately, this is not very common, but nowadays, especially in some American settings, they consider atheism, as a sickness, and we have to be aware of it. This is an interesting article for the debate, for the reflections. Chris Leteby and Wayne Gloucester address this topic, and Walsh. We don't have too much time, but I'd only highlight that it was necessary to address properly the issue of psychedelic atheism, for example, in clinical trials, the setting, and so on. Let's move forward, Christine. Self-determination, of course, self-determination is related with the rights of indigenous peoples, not only, but mainly. Liberty has had its foundations since ancient Greek philosophy through the concept of eleutheria, translated as freedom. However, a careful analysis shed light on other constitutive elements, such as terms include autonomia and autarkeia, self-sufficiency, but also parousia, freedom of speech, which designated above all the relations between freedom and self-preservation and self-determination. Analyzing the links between self-determination and autonomy within the context of psychedelic-assisted therapy requires further explanation. And regarding, for example, the rights of indigenous people, it will be useful to address self-determination with the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially regarding indigenous knowledge. Take into account, for example, the different worldviews, the different indigenous philosophy, and the right to self-determination. This is very important to develop public policies, especially in multicultural countries. Okay, freedom of thought. It's another constitutive element of cognitive liberty, and this is possible to talk about the philosophical uses of liberty. Here we have a very nice picture of Plato, with the colors and so on. And as I previously mentioned, the philosophical uses of psychedelics highlights that the psychedelic experience is a source of knowledge and not only a series of hallucinations. It's not the only approach, but I am trying to develop this. Okay, What does it mean to talk about philosophical uses of psychedelics? Here it is necessary to point out that in psychedelic research, the legitimate uses are mainly religious or therapeutic. However, this categorization is a false dichotomy because these legitimate uses are tied mainly to churches, hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies, especially, for example, regarding the psilocybin debate between Alex Boehner, and some psychiatrists. It's interesting from a philosophical perspective to move forward and to avoid the false dilemma between hospitals and churches. It's necessary to take into account a different approach. This is really important to recognize the different uses because we tend to overlap the uses. If we don't make a clear distinction of the uses, we will continue overlapping, these meanings. And for example, if you have a diagnosis, of course, you need a psychologist, a therapy, or psychiatrist. But if you don't have a diagnosis, for example, perhaps you don't need. Not everybody needs a shaman, for example, and not everybody needs a psychiatrist, right? By this reason, it's necessary to recognize the different uses because we tend to overlap, and we tend to do hasty generalization regarding these different uses. For example, nowadays, the medicalization of the psychedelic renaissance, of course, it's focused on, for example, alternatives to resistant depression. Resistant depression will become the third cause of disability in the world. More or less 700 millions of people will face resistant depression in the following years, more or less 10% of the world's population. It's not a minor issue, but of course we have the rest 90% of the population. And this medicalization, for example, doesn't take into account the 90%, the 90% of the population. By the reason it's interesting, that the following week in the British Museum will take place a gathering of psych. This very well-known reported psychedelics as medicines. And for example, analyzing this and the opening of the market of psychedelics for the following years, I was made an analysis of this calculus. And according to the Psyche report, for example, Europe spends every year 40 billion of euros in mental health issues. UK spent 90 billion of British pounds in mental health issues, and the United States spent 240 billion US dollars in mental health issues. I don't know if these numbers are true or not, but at least there are a reference. And the size of the psychedelic market, for example, for the following 5 years will be 8 billions. As I can appreciate, for example, the money spent, it's a huge amount of money. And I consider that the goal to become psychedelic into mainstream is to save money in mental health issues. And of course, open the market and so on, but mainly save money. Since the times of Humphrey Osmond in Saskatchewan during the therapies with LSD and so on, he received the authorization because his proposal was able to save time and money. And these are the main criteria for the medicalization and psychedelic capitalism. Philosophy of Psychedelics, this is one of the works, developed, work of Peter, Chris Letterby, also in Spanish. Antonio Escotado is not very well known, but he did a really, really wonderful job, phenomenology of the drugs. And of course, this is the philosophy and psychedelics. I had the privilege to contribute with the chapter 5, the Colonizing the Philosophy of Psychedelics. It's part of one of the outputs of my postdoc, and also the previous article, this book chapter, and in this article, I try to develop a colonial approach of the subject. This is another output of my research. This is a collaborative paper written with Indigenous scholars from Canada, trying to address the role of Indigenous philosophies. For example, the ontological throne has revealed both overlaps and incompatibilities between Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific knowledge. For example, many biological identity categories are similar between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems. However, some biological identity categories are incompatible. And this is interesting to address this issue, the issue of incommensurability, right? It's necessary to take into account. It's very common to know or to recognize the role of incommensurability in theory of science. For example, in the philosophy of Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend and so on. But it's necessary also to address in the field of philosophy of culture, the theory of culture, especially regarding Indigenous philosophies in plural, because we have to recognize the difficulties to, I don't want to use the word translate, but to move some categories or concepts from different worldviews based on or grounded in different epistemologies, right? And we have to recognize that some of these categories or concepts are not translatable. We have to recognize the incommensurability. On the other hand, but of course, it's possible to bridge or to develop bridges of understanding, recognizing that they are heuristic tools. They are hypotheses. For example, concepts like animism, you know, are bridges of understanding trying to address this issue, trying to achieve an understanding for both sides, but they are not the only ones. Okay. The second part of the talk is focused on epistemic injustice, because it's also one of the paradoxes embedded in the psychedelic renaissance. For example, cultural colonization prevails inside a wide array of universities, academic institutions, and research centers worldwide. By the reason, it's very important to celebrate this space of freedom of thought, you know, and space to talk about psychedelics, indigenous knowledge, develop a critical approach of medicalization, and to analyze, of course, the therapeutic alternatives. It is manifested by the lack of recognition of philosophical diversity in study programs. For example, the philosophy of psychedelics, indigenous philosophies, or feminist philosophies play a marginal role, unfortunately. For this reason, it is crucial to recognize this legacy of how cultural colonization served power structures, patriarchy, social injustice, and discrimination. The aim of this talk is toward developing a colonial analysis of some epistemic values existing in mainstream philosophy, mainly internal colonialism. The first step is to recognize the philosophical uses of psychedelics. Okay, decolonization. Decolonization is a broad, you know, movement, and it's necessary to highlight what we are understanding by decolonization. According to the proposal of Frantz Fanon, it's not the only one, but of course it's a classic, and it's very useful for psychedelic study because he was a military man, but also a psychiatrist. And the approach of Fanon, for example, it's really useful to address properly the effects, the effects of colonialism in mental health, right? Not only regarding to psychedelics, but how colonialism shaped, you know, mental health. This is internal colonialism. This is a really very brief, you know, scheme of how internal colonialism works. And according to Kim Yang, for example, internal colonialism is related with biopolitical, you know, and geopolitical management of people, land, flora, fauna, you know, all the psychedelics, within the domestic borders of the imperial nation. This involves the use of particularized modes of control, prison, ghettos, minoritizing, schooling policies. All these cultural features are present, you know, in the politics of prohibition regarding not only psychedelics, but drugs in general. Internal colonialism, for example, in Mexico, according to Pablo González Casanova, a sociologist who became commander of the Zapatista army, the rights of its inhabitants and their economic, political, social, and cultural situation are regulated and imposed by the central government. In general, the colonizers within a nation state belong to a race other than the one that dominates the national government, which is considered inferior or at most is turned into a liberating symbol that is part of the state demagogue. The majority of the colonized belong to a different culture and speak a different language from the national one. By this reason, for example, it's necessary to take into account indigenous language in order to avoid, for example, the projection of Western patterns, for example, regarding shamanism. If you are doing work in an indigenous community, and if you know the language, if you arrive to the community and ask, who is the shaman? They say, no, perhaps this is not the word. For example, in Maya, it's the Aki, in Nahuatl, the Tlamatilime, in Ñañú people, it's the Badi, and of course, all of these words have different meanings. For example, Maracame, it's the Huichol shaman. The translation is the singer, right? In the case of Nahuatl, it's the one who knows, the wise woman or wise man, and each indigenous language has very important nuances that it's necessary to take into account to achieve a better understanding of the cognitive structure of indigenous knowledge. Indigenous philosophies, for example, according to Gregory is a Tewa scholar who wrote two interesting works. The first one is called Native Science, and the second one is Philosophy of Native Science, right? The quote is from the second one. There is then a visionary tradition involved with this understanding that encompasses harmony, compassion, hunting, growing, technology, spirit, things, dance, color, number, cycle, balance, depth, and renewal. The mind and body can be used for careful, discipline, and repeatable observation. Knowledge is gathered through the body, mind, and heart in altered states of being. I want to highlight in altered states of being, in songs and dance, in meditation and reflection, and in dreams and visions. Here we have a broader approach of knowledge. We take into account altered states, not altered states of consciousness, altered states of being, which is, a cultural nuance regarding this topic. And of course, this is a wonderful image from the Rarica people. It has, a meaning. This is the Nierica. And the Nierica, for example, it's a door between different worlds, right? It's a kind of the eye of God, right? We don't have time to explain this with detail, right? But later, perhaps. On the ontological turn, of course, it's contested, but regarding, for example, these fungi stones from Guatemala, from the Maya culture, the archaeological evidence, for example, indicates that psychedelic plants and fungi have been used for at least 3,000 years in Mesoamerica. The main uses, again, cultural uses recorded for indigenous people are sacred or ritual, therapeutic uses, and 3 divinatory uses. Nowadays divinatory uses are, old-fashioned. But we have to take into account it's another cultural uses. The process of personification of sacred entities is one of the central features of the ontology of indigenous peoples, used in philosophical vocabulary. Thus, it is necessary to take an ontological turn to better understand the sacred and ritual uses of psilocybin mushrooms. This implies recognizing that there are different ways of relating human beings and nature, other than the paradigm that prevails in Western culture. And 4, recognizing this ontological pluralism is the first step towards a better understanding of the cultural usage mentioned above. Based on the ontology of the indigenous people, mushrooms are not be considered a drug or a psychoactive substance, but rather as sacred beings or entities with which reciprocal relationships are established. But also ontological pluralism is not only a scholarly matter, it's related with legal pluralism. If we want to address properly legal pluralism, first of all, it's necessary to make a philosophical step. recognize the ontological pluralism, because legal pluralism it's a really important issue in a multicultural state. For example, a cross-cultural democracy, it's needed in the States, in Canada, in Mexico, in Europe, a cross-cultural psychiatry, a cross-cultural psychedelic assisted therapy, it's required, it's not easy, but how to develop a cross-cultural democracy, how to develop a cross-cultural psychedelic assisted therapy if we don't know, if we don't understand properly, you know, the indigenous philosophy, right? 5, in the worldview of indigenous peoples, the native peoples, the earth, the air, the mountains, the clouds, and of course the sacred mushrooms are entities endowed with life. A personality is attributed to them, and it is possible to establish communication through sacred and ritual language. For example, peyote and mushroom are not isolated from the territory. From a Western perspective, we tend to isolate it, right? We tend to focus on the substances. And in indigenous worldview, it's a different approach, and they are not isolated from the sacred landscape, from the territory. Even nowadays in the psychedelic renaissance, we are focused on psilocybin. There is not a single study worldwide focused on natural mushrooms, on organic mushrooms. Nowadays, I am collaborating in a project in Mexico, Project Teonanacatl, a dialogue of knowledge, and they are performed, for example, the first chemical analysis of psilocybin cubensis, not an indigenous use of this species in Mexico, but the student that is working on this issue spends almost 1 year, you know, in the analysis, and they don't finish yet. And it is necessary, for example, to know the entourage effect, you know, not only the psilocybin, but also another substances present in the fungi. This is a really interesting how in the Western culture we tend to isolate, you know, the different components of the psychedelic. Yeah, this is the book of Gregory Cajete, Native Science, you know, written by an indigenous scholars. Nowadays, for example, the government of Canada recognized a Ministry of Indigenous Science. No? It will be controversial, perhaps. Some people would agree or disagree that the concept of science, you know, fits or not with indigenous knowledge. It's an open question. I don't have an answer to this. We have to address if this proposal is right or it has some implication. Well, only to the previous one, yeah. Only to highlight this. Another topic, animism, according to Gregory Cajete. I want to highlight this quote. For example, according to Cajete, the word animism perpetuates a modern prejudice, a disdain and a projection of inferiority toward the worldview of indigenous people. But if, as the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty contends, perception as its most elemental expression in the human body is based in our participation with our surroundings, then it can be said that animism is a basic human trait common to both indigenous and modern sensibilities. This is a statement. As a philosophers, no, we can to discuss, right? Maria Sabina, you know, we are approaching to the end of this part of the conference. Wise woman. The work of woman is frequently overlooked, also in the psychedelic sphere, in psychedelic space, mostly the knowledge of indigenous women, and mostly, for example, Maria Sabina was a wise woman, but for example, she was illiterate. Also, for example, she was not able to speak Spanish. And and of course, our understanding of her thoughts is mediated by translations, reinterpretations, hasty generalization, and commodification, right? It's a kind of unknown world yet, right? Neocolonialism, for example, in 1957, it's another approach. Life magazine published one of the most impactful articles in modern history about psychedelics. Seeking the Magic Mushroom was written by a former J.P. Morgan banker. You know, that's the point. How to address the relationship between a GP a Morgan banker, and an indigenous woman. Of course, we have to address this issue according to the framework developed by Foucault of power relations, how the power relations are working. Of course, it's important not to idealize Maria Sabina and condemn Robert Gordon Wasson, but it's impossible don't take into account the imbalance of power. For example, Robert Gordon Wasson arrived by plane to the village, right? You know, because there was no way to do it, you know, by bus or by car. But can you imagine 550 years ago arriving to the village in a plane, you know, to perform some research? This imbalance of power, it's necessary to take into account. But moreover, he made a promise to don't develop the identity of Maria Sabina. However, within 2 years of the story publishing, psilocybin and psilocybin, the main active compounds in the mushrooms, were isolated, characterized, synthesized, and named by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann at the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company. And Sandoz quickly patented the extraction procedure and a method for therapeutic tranquilization, marketing pills under the trade name Indocibin. Of course, Albert Hofmann is a very well-known scientist with a wonderful work, but also conscious or unconscious, he was part of this extractivism process. For example, the name of Indocibin. Oh, come on. Yeah, Indocibin. It's a treatment for therapeutic tranquilization, and it's necessary to address critically this issue. Not to deny science, but also to recognize that science is not an innocent, you know, activity, as Donna Haraway states very clearly.
Yeah, you have 17 more slides. You're over time.
Oh,
By the way, in your powerful position as speaker, I'm naming myself a powerful person pressing the button.
no.
Actually asking to make it right to the one.
A couple of slides and then I will close. But this is the colonialism. Let's move on. Only an example. Well, this one. The another slides have only examples of. From an indigenous perspective, according to the work of Gregory et al., of course, we have to discuss this. Psilocybin research and drug development, in order to move forward with the presentation, tells a story of extraction, cultural appropriation, bioprospecting, and colonization in life. Magazine article Robert Gordon Wasson wrote of his expedition to Oaxaca, and wrote of his expeditions. He initially protected with the pseudonym Eva Mendes. Eva Mendes was the nickname of Maria Sabina, but however, Wilson ultimately betrayed his promise and revealed his teacher's identity, curandera or wise woman. And his second volume, Mushroom, in his second volume, Mushroom, Russia and History. He also widely published and publicized her photographs, thus constituting further betrayal. After Wilson's visit to Huautla de Jimenez, conflict ensued. Maria Sabina was briefly jailed, and her house was set on fire. Of course, the department of Robert Gordon Wilson in Manhattan was really safe, you know, after the encounter. But in the case of Maria Sabina, the house was set on fire. Imbalances of power, right? And to close this, only to highlight some works, you know, with the next slide. If you are interested, for example, these works, move forward, Christine, please. For example, ethical concerns and ethical principles. I recommend these two readings because both are written by indigenous scholars, right? All of them are indigenous scholars. Yeah. The Psychedelic Perspective of Globalization of Psilocybin, you know, research carried out by indigenous scholars, we have to take into account. And that's it. This is another example of colonialism, the case of Birarica people within the Viricuta Desert. This sacred land, for example, was sold to Majestic Silver Company in Vancouver. All the territory in which the peyote grows it's under a mining concession, right? This is the map, you know. This is the region in which the peyote grows in the state. This is not enough to supply, for example, all the needs of the Native American church. You know, all the peyote comes from this region in Mexico. Some issues regarding psychedelic feminism. I am not a specialist. Perhaps some people it's more qualified to address properly. And the role of women and psychedelics regarding to colonialism, and then to close, you know, the concept of psychedelic justice in order to make a counterweight of the epistemic injustice. I recommend this book to achieve a plural overview of this topic. Conclusions, right? No conclusion. Yeah. No. The last. Okay. The colonizing the philosophy of psychedelics implies the issuing of new questions and avenues of research to replace the internal colonialisms which prevail in mainstream philosophy by another type of philosophy based on cognitive liberty, and one capable of opening our talk to a different of mental landscapes. To move beyond the false dichotomy between hospitals and churches, freedom of choice, it is necessary to critically address the philosophical uses of psychedelic experience. And thank you very much for your time.
Because we have some minutes questions now, let's make it 10.
Yeah.
Should we?
So I was thinking that you have like the way I thought about this is probably you're advising us to have a political philosopher instead of a psychiatrist or a shaman, you know, right at the beginning. And I like the idea. But there are a couple of things like sovereignty that I think are problematic in itself as concept. I'm thinking with Alan and freedom, even self-determination is one of those things that is not a neutral term, right? So these notions of sovereignty, can you expand on that and the implications of autarky? And what does that does freedom, especially in an American way, that freedom is exactly the opposite of sovereignty?
Yeah, the sovereignty is a contested issue. It's a controversial issue. For example, according to the hypothesis of Oliver Davies from the Warwick University, for example, he wrote a paper on the autonomy and the psychedelic assisted therapy. And of course, the notion of sovereignty, it's controversial or it's contested, for example, and the right of self-determination regarding international relations, right? But it's necessary to reshape in the psychedelic space, for example, mental sovereignty, you know, or mental autonomy. It's necessary, for example, to build a specific framework, you know, because in the political spheres, it is possible to appreciate a lot of contradictions, right? And you know, mental sovereignty or sovereignty is related first of all with country, but how about individual sovereignty? It is possible or not? No, because we are embedding a set of power relations. No, which are the borders of this sovereignty, right? So, moreover, the self-determination rights, it could be understood as a way of separatism, you know, in most countries. For example, this is the fear in Mexico, but also in Spain. You know, the self-determination of the autonomic regions, right? It implies a lot of problems. In the case of psychedelic assisted therapy, it has two ways, you know, regarding the individual, but also regarding indigenous peoples. And mostly, for example, the self-determination is focused on the right of indigenous peoples to determine their own ways of living. And according, for example, to the final slides, it's necessary, for example, to take into account the works of indigenous scholars and communitary assemblies to move forward, for example, with this research, you know?
And isn't sovereignty itself a colonial legacy, right? That political notion itself, I would say, is linked with this colonialism of political philosophy over other indigenous ways of governance.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, there's something that, so it's deeply problematic from the side of Hannah Arendt, right? Freedom is completely opposed to sovereignty, and then from the side of the colonial issue, sovereignty is also the imposition of the Eurocentric political imagination on themselves.
Yeah.
So do we really need sovereignty there?
It's freedom as a tool of domination, right? It's one of the aspects. You know, if you are talking about freedom, you have to take into account, you know, the different nuances. And of course, it's good to analyze and to criticize these notions, right? But according to this framework, it's necessary, you know, to deal with, you know, from different approaches, of course, the critical one, but also, for example, it opens another base of research. You know, it's kind of the Greek concept of aletria, you know, that you reveal something, but at the same time you are hidden. You know, the reality is a paradox. It's one of the paradoxes. You know, it would be possible, for example, to develop a research on the paradoxes of liberty or the paradoxes of freedom, right? How freedom or liberty are used as a domination tools. It's the thing that you are stating. Yeah, but you are right in that sense. Helene, please.
So it's really nice to have you here, Osiris. I'm grateful, actually. And I keep thinking. So, I think what I'm going to say is similar to the point that Ernesto just picked up. So this idea of knowledge, I also think that it has become a notion that carries very Western and colonial sort of approaches to understanding. And so I wonder if, you know, for the purposes of bridging, let's say, we might want better off thinking about wisdom and experience rather than knowledge and understanding, for example, when it comes to psychedelic experiences and indigenous wisdom and in general, rather than, because I think knowledge brings with it this idea of systematic kind of understanding, some sort of structure of thought that I think is quite Western. And so maybe to me at least the idea of wisdom is closer to what we're trying to do, and it also makes better. It's more connected to life, and it seems to me that whenever we talk about indigenous knowledge, this is what we are referring to. So disconnectedness, awareness of life around us, etc. So I think wisdom would be a better notion, and it also links better to the idea of expansion of consciousness, because I'm struggling to see the link between expansion of consciousness and knowledge, which can be very, you know, structured and kind of put in a box and say knowledge about something, knowledge of something. Whereas the expansion of consciousness, at least to me, I'm not clear what it means in terms of knowledge. So, okay. What do you think?
Good questions regarding, for example, knowledge. I want to highlight the fact, for example, that by your reason, it's important to know indigenous languages. You know, because knowledge is one of these, you know, categories or these heuristic tools, at least in Nahuatl language, which is the indigenous language that I know. For example, the verb mati, it's at the same time to wise and to feel, not isolated, to know and to feel. And in Nahuatl language, there is a difference between wisdom and knowledge, right? The word for the old fashioned, and the word for wisdom in Nahuatl is tlamatilislli, and the word for knowledge is tlaixmatilistli. The prefix x refers to the eyes and to the face. You know, the difference, for example, between wisdom and knowledge in Nahuatl language is that in the process of knowledge, the eyes and the brain are involved. And you can find, for example, the word in different manuscripts from 16th century. For example, in the Florentine Codex, when they refer to the physician, they refer as the one who knows the plants, the one who knows the trees, the one who knows the roots, with the word knowledge, right? And of course, knowledge or science, it's more contested, for example, native science, according to the proposal of Gregory, right? But regarding knowledge, it will be useful, for example, to address the specific indigenous languages. At least in Nahuatl, there is a difference, between wisdom and knowledge. And knowledge is it's part of the cognitive structures of Nahuatl people.
Oh, I think,
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really interesting. And I especially like how you're sort of moving away from the easy critique of the prohibitionist framework to the more interesting critique of the sort of psychedelic capitalism framework, right?
Yep.
And I think that the sort of the indigenous perspective has a lot to offer us here. But I think that, well, first of all, I think that we could say a little bit more maybe about some of the problems with how, and I don't want to sort of, again, homogenize indigenous pieces of psychedelics because they're often varied, right? And we have, but I mean, there is oftentimes this kind of master disciple relationship that's associated with psychedelic initiation in indigenous cultures. And then this leads to my question. I would like to provoke you a little bit on that one, but I also want to bring in a fourth possible framework, which would be the kind of the welfare state's idea of consumer protection, right? Which has a whole separate set of ideas about freedom in terms of, freedom of choice, freedom to make, sort of informed decisions on the basis of good advertising, right? Sort of making sure qualified professionals are involved at all levels, and that there's some sort of, so I'm curious sort of how you would sort of take criticisms of the indigenous paradigm to the degree we can talk about such a thing, and also whether you have thoughts about the kind of a more welfare state kind of regulatory approach to psychedelics that you might also bring in, that isn't prohibitionist, but isn't laissez-faire.
Yeah, but the reason it's necessary to develop a cross-cultural approach, for example, in the case of Nahuatl people, for example, the way to initiate the shaman, it's through a thunderbolt. Right. If you survive to a process of a thunderbolt, you are able to heal. It's not an easy, it's not only a game,
yeah. Right?
For example, in the Popocatépetl region, the Tiempero, the Granicero, it's the one to survive the heat of the thunderbolt. And this is a special person, right?
although it becomes hereditary afterwards. So if your granddad was one hit by the thunderbolt, then your kids become Timperos as well. You can have that to be used.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like something they're
and the transference of knowledge among generation, right? On the other hand, you have the regulatory framework of the welfare state, but also, for example, in the welfare state or in the Western state, you have some political issues regarding indigenous autonomy or sovereignty or indigenous autonomy, and the challenge is how to take into account or to consider these different liberties, how to recognize properly the right of self-determination of indigenous people, even, for example, the right to refuse, the right to say, no, I don't want that this research will be carried on this topic. And on the other hand, recognize, for example, that we tend to idealize freedom. We tend to idealize liberty, and very few of us consider freedom as a tool of domination. Only to close, for example, this, I start to thinking about freedom as a domination tool 20 years ago, more or less, when the 11th of September, terrorist attacks, so on. I was, of course, there were not mobile phones and so on. I was moving to my English lesson very close in the morning. And okay, the attacks and so on. And the next image that I saw, it's George Bush in this huge ship surrounded by militaries, and the Marines and so on. And he stated, his discourse, freedom was attacked. Freedom was attacked. You assume that the states are the freedom and the freedom was attacked. And now, and to this, now we'll be bombing this country. And from, freedom was attacked. And then my response is, to make the war. This is a paradox. It doesn't care if you are, supporting the welfare state. This is the paradox of freedom, right?
So I would like to know, we have time for this.
Well, I just speak fast.
Okay, what is your positionality in terms of native science? I find the whole term kind of like a perfect example of colonialism, right? So this idea that indigenous people have to look like science, and lots of the critiques that come from the colonial literature is, why the hell do we need native science? Why needs to be compared to these scientific space? And you brought that up, so I just wanted to know what is your position there?
Well, it's the same case of religion or philosophy. They are the heuristic tools, in the anthropology, for example, in the anthropology research, nobody, questions religion. We assume religion as a universal fact, a universal character, right? And of course, you have to address the both sides, For example, your position is one way, On the other hand, for example, if we don't recognize indigenous philosophies, right, or indigenous science or indigenous knowledge, remember that they are heuristic tools, and we have an incommensurability, and all these categories are breaches of understanding. It's not an easy topic. It's not an easy issue, and of course, a dogmatic perspective, for example, it's not the best way to do it. Of course, it's a philosophical, proposal, and we have the right to criticize the proposal of Gregory. I only put on the debate table, but it's the same. For example, shamanism. Science, shamanism, religion, philosophy. Of course, all of them are Western concepts. But it's an attempt to deal, with this incommensurability. I don't have, and anyone has an individual answer for this. It will be a collective work of reflection to address these issues properly. And the paradoxes, by the reason I mentioned, this Hegelian view of the paradoxes, our starting point is contradictions. From a philosophical approach, of course, if you are developing a clinical trial or so on, you have to be careful with other issues, right? But from a philosophical perspective, there are a lot of contradictions embedded in this field, right?
Thank you. So please hold further questions towards the end. Let's see whether I can answer.
I can for now.
But I've now changed the way that we set up. It might be much easier. So we thought we divide this up, this workshop on ethics in the psychedelic space, and we speak each about what we know better. Osiris and I have been working together with numerous other colleagues in Exeter and worldwide in a sort of decolonizing discussion group, which meets hybrid every few weeks. With that, we have produced one paper together, and now we are starting a new one. But my expertise is far more on the clinical trials. And so I will now look at sort of some ethical aspects that I will point out, issues, how these models of power and how power is enacted within the clinical setting in psychedelics. So I will speak first about what, I show you an image I've made, and then go into the clinical trial scientific method. Then I will talk about alienation disconnection. I will go a little bit into the discussion about music playing as a technology of sort of controlling clinical trials and how this is presented within the science, because it is so interestingly unashamedly guiding and controlling the experiences people have, which may, in the clinical case of people with a diagnosis, be necessary to achieve the aims of the therapeutic outcome. But the main point to this, which I will come back in the end, is that if we actually allow this to be the route to access psychedelic experiences, we don't have any philosophically or otherwise relevant psychedelic experiences at all, because the therapeutic purpose is very peculiar, and this is the point I'm going to try to make here. Okay, and then I rushed out of it. So there are sort of three different, nice image, isn't it? So I will talk mainly about clinical trials and a little bit about the utilization and utilitarian uses of psychedelics that rest in this. And I will not talk much about these other two aspects that came up in Osiris's talk, and which we have to discuss more in a different time. But these, of course, are really important to realize that medicine is not, or psychiatry and psychology are not independent spaces. They are very closely woven in, and this will come up at points, with other social technologies of domination and social practices to which, again, medicine itself has to justify itself, and that makes it choose many of its priorities. It's not a sort of closed space. It is deeply interconnected and interwoven with other spaces, and a lot of the decisions that I'm problematizing here may not be chosen voluntarily. That doesn't mean that doesn't make them better, but it's not that I'm standing here accusing the medical domain. It's important to be aware that this is, a lot of this is very contextual and woven in with other interests, be they economic, be they political, be they religious. Okay, so knowledge, and I like that word knowledge, and I like it in particular actually in the plural. I think knowledge is a really good one to use. But knowledge in the social order of enlightened capitalism become a form of power. Many theorists have been arguing this. I'm not going into detail here, but that means in the psychedelic space that it is aimed at owning knowledge, owning drugs, owning treatment protocols, and we have, of course, a whole apparatus originally not developed for medicine as much as for other industries, but then carried over into the medical domain from patenting and intellectual property licensing regimes. So there is a way in which actually these medical treatments that are being patented suffer from the way in which the way in which intellectual property rights are protected is not particularly suitable to what actually a patient-doctor relationship is. But this is the way we do things now. So we have to take this into account. And of course, science is an intricate part of this, because it does two things that are essential for this knowledge making and power within this sort of system we live in. It classifies and it typifies, and it de-individualizes in this clinical space. And these are the two topics that we'll be talking about. So first, clinical trials, standardization. Some of you have heard me say some of this before. I apologize for that, so I'll do it anyway, because I'm finding this so fascinating. So what does a clinical trial actually do? It is there to show that a particular treatment, and I say treatment now, even though originally they were designed for chemicals, drugs. It's actually a problem to use clinical trials, and that is not only true for psychedelics, that is true for the whole of regenerative medicine. There's a big problem now with the way in which clinical trials are very impractical to some degree for more complex treatment protocols that require a lot of different interactions, not just a chemical given to a person. And that is true, of course, here, because all the psychedelics protocols involve talking about them. And so you have these human-to-human interactions that are really critical for the outcome, which, however, are very difficult to measure. So what you try to do is you have an intervention, you want to exactly know whether this particular intervention in a particular type of people achieves the desired outcome. This is what you're trying to prove. In order to prove this, you have to standardize, ideally, everything about the situation. The patients have to be the same, the setting has to be the same, the couch has to be the same on which people experience their psychedelic trip, etc., etc. The music, the environment should be the same, so that you can say it's really this amount of psilocybin, of LSD, of MDMA, that in patients with this particular diagnosis has reliably, in 80% of the them the desired effect. And in 2 of them, you might have 2% you might have adverse outcome, and the rest is sort of neutral. So let's get this approved. This is the aim. This is the gold standard for all this research in medicine now. It's been contested for a long time because it is problematic for numerous reasons. And as Hansen writes in 2014, opposition against research clinical trials has historically been very strong in psychology and psychiatry because it's very aware of the human dimension of interaction. But these criteria of repeatability and generalizability now hold sway, even in this field. So we are trying to square a circle. We are trying to standardize stuff that obviously can't be standardized, as I just said. The patients should be the same. I mean, what does that actually mean? That means we give them a particular diagnosis according to a particular way in which we come to diagnoses. We try to avoid having this diagnosis messy. So we try to avoid people having multiple diagnoses at the same time, taking certain drugs that might interfere with it, etc., etc. Yeah, having certain other comorbidities, this kind of stuff. But actually, to say that 2 people with the same disease are the same people is obviously weird, especially when the stuff we expose them to is not just a chemical, but a music playlist, and then a lot of talking about an experience that they might put into very different contexts. So this way in which we try to square a circle here really is the key point to criticize. These 2 papers, last year and the year before, have been trying to look at this by people who are involved with clinical trials themselves, and they have really been illustrating what the problems are. They've done a quite detailed analysis of the problem, for example, in looking at serious adverse events, but I don't want to go into this now. It would take a bit of time to explain. But so they really wanted to show, next slide please, that actually they wanted to write a manifesto for embracing the weirdness of psychedelics and square this with actually still doing clinical trial research with psychedelics by making better trials. But one shouldn't steer away in clinical medicine, they clearly argue, on the other hand, from the unscientific that lies within the psychedelic. The unique individual experience, the ways in which we actually can't predict what the response of the organism, because it's not just the organism, it's the person, will be to the intervention, etc. They highlight the reality and the importance of the psychedelic experience itself. There have recently been proposals to take the experience out of the psychedelic treatment catalog, as you may know. I remember Yuki Hendry mentioned that as well in his talk, that people were thinking of developing psychedelics that create the same kind of phenomena when you do the brain scans without people actually having a trip experience. I haven't found many psychologists who think this is any viable at all. So if it's, however, the person's experience, then we need to think about how we can do this. So how can we quantify and qualify what they then call the mystical experience, and how to setting cultural context and expectations, but also the state, the person-person interaction within any concrete setting affect the outcome. So this is the systematic review of adverse events. I thought I deleted that slide. I have not. You can look at this on the recording. I don't want to go through it. But mainly they point out all the problems that they have identified as being real weaknesses in the material that is currently available from existing clinical trials to even be serious about reporting serious adverse events or even identifying what counts as such. That's not only a problem in psychedelic trials either, but it's just one attempt at showing we could make trials better, and what we would need to make them better, at least concerning this one criterion. Yeah? But in the end, we come back to what I said before, where there are so many epistemological problems, such as the cause and effect relationship is very tenuous, right? Then that most patients in reality actually have multiple diagnoses. Their personalities, relationships to the therapeutic response, etc., are different. There is no guarantee ever of individual effectiveness anyway, and how to measure that. One needs the psychological support, and then psychological support would maybe ideally be given by somebody with whom that person who has a mental health problem already has psychological support from, rather than actually having a psychedelic environment in which you do this kind of treatment, but then you have the therapist you're working with at home. We know, however, that psychedelic therapists have been in court, and that is not the way things have been going. It might, however, still be something to keep in mind. That established therapeutic relationships might be a much better environment for using psychedelics than the currently proposed ones. And then, of course, the importance of the trip experience. Right?
Yeah, sure.
Are better trials desirable, though? Yes, we could make them better. There are many things people have been pointing out, how they could be scientifically better, more rigorous, or maybe with a lot of other factors included. We measure much more different things, we open up some of that space. But is that, well, if we record more and more detail, we define and standardize more and more of the detail, like which couch to use, does this actually, from a wider ethical perspective, make this more acceptable? And what level of generalization can we achieve from this? And I think actually, I seriously doubt that you could make these clinical trials in the scientific sense much better, because the cultural embeddedness of meaning making within the clinical setting and the individual meaning making processes will always mean that there is a huge aspect of such an intervention that you can in no way standardize, that is culturally specific, it's individually specific, etc. So is this even a good way forward? Thinking about what we are doing outside of what we need to do to get FDA or otherwise approved. So participants need a diagnosis. That is one issue, one point I take issue with. That, of course, should psychedelics, and that gets to the point Osiris made, that is really in this clinical setting, only with a diagnosis will people get access to psychedelics. If we say that this is the route to decriminalization and to a wider use and to making them mainstream, I think that's probably a lie. If the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industries have their hold on something that can only through their gateways be accessed, what on earth makes us think that this will end up on the shelves of boots? Which maybe it shouldn't. So there is this need to control everything, which is a form of epistemic violence. And I think that is really true in the case of these mysticism questionnaires, or this whole way in which people's experiences are couched into a particular language, into a particular rhetoric that sort of comes with often the treatment protocol and the questionnaires you have chosen to make people fill in at the end. So there is a way in which having to talk about it with somebody who comes with a whole set of expectations that you know before you even enter, get your first drug dose. Yeah. How do you actually, how is this a free experience in any way? It is corseted into a diagnosis, into a particular purpose, and then you are already being told, and the questionnaires tell you even more so, how to read your own experience. So free psychedelic experience, this is not. Then the issue of trust I already mentioned, and then of course there is the risk of hype. For people who are really vulnerable, the risk that they see this as a or the solution to their mental health crisis is actually dangerous. Not only because it might disappoint, but because they might seek very unsafe settings if they can't get access through the currently very restricted channels. But we have a huge public debate. And I mean, in the new ketamine trial, this is one of the factors we actually would like to know about, whether between 5 years ago and now we have a huge difference in the way in which people see their own experience, what they expect from being part of this trial, because they've been reading up on it. It's over the news, and 5 years ago it wasn't. And that could very much affect the outcome of the trial, the whole way in which people come into this, how the attitude they take towards it, even though we have It's no means proper measuring in comparison, but there will be something that from what people say we can conclude. So the ambiguity of diagnosis, I said that is one of my key points. Diagnosis can be very liberating. People who suffer, say, from a friend of mine has Parkinson's, had that diagnosed when she was about 60. And that was really a relief because she was for years falling down the stairs, knocking over stuff, not knowing what was wrong with her, having foggy mind, thinking she was losing it, and then not much of some of this has changed with medication, but to actually know what you've got. And there's actually a whole history and treatment protocols and stuff that can be done. And also what the scope of this is can be really important. So I'm not saying diagnosis is a bad thing, but there is another aspect to diagnosis, and that is simply classifying people into boxes. That's what the DSM does. It's sort of making all these treatment-resistant depressions one thing. And all the people with Parkinson's, yes, there's then the differential diagnosis, etc. But there is still an approach in which, when we say people with a particular diagnosis are allowed to take part in this trial, we have a very clear sense of what this means and what these people have to be like in order to be admitted. It's a practice of subjugation, because once you have got the diagnosis, and my friend with Parkinson's, she was fairly willing to actually find the treatment at my airport. But on the other hand, it is also a subject position of being sort of told what to do. There is now a body of authority, of experts, of medical records, of history of knowledge that will actually tell you, or other people tell you, what you need to do to get as good as you can be under the circumstances. So we don't get treatment without diagnosis, but as soon as you are in the you are diagnosed, you are in the position of receiving that knowledge that others have about how you best go about this now. And so this is a structure of power in which individuals are enveloped. We had the wider economic issues that come into this medicine. I don't want to talk about this much now because actually Osiris mentioned them, so let's just go to the next slide. But given all this, maybe we need to take a step back. What are we actually doing when we think about psychedelics and therapeutic uses of psychedelics in what currently the scientific environment expects one to deliver? Are we caught in an ideological bubble of groupthink? The original word for groupthink was thought collective. Next slide. A term introduced by this chap, Ludwig Fleck, who I think is the founder of Science and Technology Studies. A very old book, though, from 1935. And it is, he introduces this as being a medic himself, looking at some medical history of medical diagnosis and how long it sometimes took to actually overcome ideas that were established in a sort of senior committee to break through. And feminist philosophy of science has shown us many cases. We know very well, and that there is a way in which thought collectives dominate the scientific field. And whether you look at Kuhn or at Foucault, there are others who have made similar ideas, but there is this resistance to change the frame. And it seems to me, I've presented quite a lot of evidence why, for thinking about how psychedelics might in our society be a helpful thing to have, if we learn how to manage it, medicine might not be the right way. So back to my original graphic, I know we'll get to the second bit of the utilization of the experiences, the ways in which in these clinical settings, and I think that is true for the sterility of these settings, for numerous reasons, as I will show, there is a utilization of these experiences that actually makes them really something that is an imposition on individuals rather than something that has anything to do with cognitive freedom or self-determination. Next slide. So this is a colonizing an experience? How do you actually say an experience is colonized? Can an experience I have be colonized? So psychedelic experiences are intense, and many people seem to report change attitudes to their self, to their life, to nature, and to spirituality. Do such experiences connect to indigenous worldviews? Is there something that we have sort of are increasingly carrying over from sort of the Maria Sabina Gordon-Wasson situation through to the ways in which treatment protocols are developed, where we actually need to think about individual context dependency of where a person is. Then there's the aspect of self-transcendence and the question of being one with nature. I will come to that. And then I won't talk about it much because I've published on this in this chapter. I've quoted at the top of this here, this whole paradoxy of making the crazy or the mad part of a treatment protocol against madness. And then this way in which it is almost ironical that psychiatrists now experts on this decision. It's really sort of when you think about it, that from, I mean, of course, psychology has always taken over stuff that previously was in the realm, indeed, of the church, where people go to make confession, but they talk about their more conflicts, where they do talk about the stuff that they can't sort out in their lives and get guidance. And yes, psychology had, throughout its history, sort of an element of taking some of this into a very different space, that of science in a different kind of relationship, a secular space. But are we now seeing a reversal of this? Or is psychology just taking over a whole other chunk of what we classically think really lies in a different realm, both within the academy as well as in society? So looking at what scientists are writing, and this comes back to my power thing when I say this is actually a form of alienation rather than a form of self-discovery. So in this particular protocol, I have more of this, but I put only this one in. They say psilocybin was administered. That's how a clinical trial protocol describes itself, in opaque gelatin capsule with approximately 100 milliliters of water. Most facilitators were present in the room and available to respond to the participants' physical and emotional needs during the day-long session, with the exception of short breaks taken by one facilitator at a time. So they needed a week and food. During the session, participants were instructed to lie on a couch in a living room-like environment, and facilitators encouraged participants to focus their attention inward and stay with any experience that arose. To enhance inward reflection, music was played, playlists provided, and participants were instructed to wear eye shades and headphones. Thanks. So this thing about the playlist. The idea that you would actually give a person a psychedelic on their diagnosis to help them out, and then, however, you would have a very clear idea of choreographing or directing their trip experience. Huh? So this is part of the playlist, and it shows you really nicely how they imagine a trip would go. Yeah. So it starts and it's softly with all this lame classical music. Then the psilocybin begins to take effect, and we go to Edward and Brahms. Yeah, Felix wieder Leidtragen. Gott on us. I mean, who makes these choices? Most of this religious music or Christian music, or I mean, why? Then we have a Kyrie, then then we get to the peak, and it's Mozart. Yeah? And then we have another Largo Tranquillissimo. Then we have some Strauss post-peak, okay, Moderato and Tranquillo. And it says underneath death and transfiguration.
Yeah. So one of their earlier playlists included Mars Bringer of War or something. That's a really good one.
Well, these lists, there are quite a lot of them, and
Yes.
they're different, but there's no 1960s, 1970s music in it. There's basically hardly any indigenous or other world music in it. There's no contemporary music in this, and this must be for the middle-class American people who have not grown up with European classical music, because I actually know this music. To me, this is not some neutral input I could put in my head. I've seen this play live, most of it. Some of it I could once play on the piano. So this is sort of, for me, not a playlist with which anybody could not guide what goes on in me when I hear this, might do sorts of things, but maybe not that. So this is quite strange. But next slide.
Yeah.
And Sabina dropped out and needs to be readmitted.
Oh.
So then what they say about this playlist is also interesting. We developed a certain intuitive list of favorites that just seems to work well with a lot of people. People's experiences were going deeper and deeper, becoming very profound. Was that the mindset? The music in each section is deliberately chosen to accompany a particular part of the psychedelic journey. For example, Richards finds that Samuel Barber's iconic Adagio for strings works well as participants approach the peak when the effect of the psilocybin are steadily intensifying. The music chromatically develops and it goes up and reaches this exquisite climax and then comes back down. For the onset of the drugs, best music is unfolding and has a dependable structure. So that's what they want, yeah? An unfolding, dependable structure. And key is a net of reassurance, almost, and of leadership. So almost reassured, but definitely leadership. Yeah? The music helps keep participants from prematurely returning to normal conscious awareness. And the majority of the music is either instrumental or choral with non-English text, and purposefully so. German then. Right? In order to keep participants inside the experience, only the last section of the playlist uses selections with recognizable words when they're supposed to come back. Okay? So it's English, recognizable words, I guess, right? If you're truly trying to shift consciousness beyond the level of the everyday self, you have to go beyond language. So this is what the role of the music here is. It's very clear. The idea that there's anything self-determined in this trip experience, or as I said earlier, that the same people would respond the same to whatever you give them, are both, I think, absurd when you look at the detail in which they present. So there is, however, this evidence for a central role of music in psychedelic therapy. Doesn't surprise us after that. And so there is this whole choreography of pre-onset, onset, building towards the peak, re-entry and return. And then in this group of Canaan tried to actually measure that, and they analyzed the music and how people would respond by asking people how they felt about the music they had been hearing. So they did a project, the Hidden Therapist, Evidence for Central Role of Music in Psychedelic Therapy, and they asked people about whether they liked it, Likert scale, so you get like it very much, like it a little, like it not at all, you know. Resonance and harmoniousness and openness were the criteria, the grand criteria they were asked about, okay? Next. So the results. Analysis of the interviews revealed that the music had both welcome and unwelcome influences, the interviews as well, on patients' subjective experience. Conversely, unwelcome influences included the invocation of unpleasant emotion and imagery, a sense of being misguided, and resistance. Correlation analysis showed that patients' experience of the music was associated with the occurrence of mystic experiences and insightfulness. Crucially, the nature of the music experience was significantly predictive of reductions in depression 1 week after psilocybin, whereas general drug intensity was not. That's interesting. So the music is maybe as important as the drug dose. So when I now say that this music is, however, a way in which really people are made to experience particular, at least intensities of emotions, affect, and states of mind, then this fact that the music plays such a key role is puzzling. The study indicates that music plays a central therapeutic function in psychedelic therapy. So then there is the dissonance. Of course, that was for me the most interesting thing. What did they find out about dissonances? The most prominent cluster, including 5 out of 10 participants, described music to intensify emotions they did not want to feel, such as increased fearfulness, sadness, or fear. In addition, 5 out of 10, again 50%, made statements, it's very small numbers, so in these interviews, made statements about the music creating a sense of discomfort, including unpleasant or uncomfortable experiences, and 4 out of 10 described irritation as a consequence of the music. 6 out of 19 made statements about misguidance, that they felt the music was actually getting them off and somewhere they didn't be. A mismatch to what they were feeling in their experience. So they had to work to get rid of the music whilst they were trying to move on somewhere. And then 30% include descriptions of the music feeling intrusive, being unable to positively influence a challenging situation or experience, and giving a sense of being manipulated. The music giving a sense of unmet potential. So there would have been more in my trip if only you had let me go there and not your music told me when to go up and when to go down. So as 30% perceives this as actually really interfering seriously with their experience. And remind me, small number. Is this a good or a bad thing? Of course, in the grand scheme of things, when you go to the FDA and 70% of people with that diagnosis, this treatment protocol with that particular music playlist works really well, at least say in Kansas, then that means that could still very well worth pursuing. Yeah? Being able to help 70% out of 100 is not a bad thing. On the other hand, the music that is being used is so culturally imprinted. This carries so much cultural ideas with it. It's so white that this is really, when you think about branching this out and getting universal treatments, we are nowhere near this. If the music is so important, we need a very different design of thinking about how, in the case of people with mental health issues, psychedelic drugs could help them. None of this can easily be scaled up. Go with this music playlist in other parts of the world. This is obviously strange. And so the solution then, of course, is that we need a significant body of empirical work to test out how this might work, how we can actually predictively measure. So science, if you find something doesn't work in science, you always propose more science, more rigid science, just like I said, Brexham have been and Hughes have been doing. This is the same here. Yeah, we need more rigid, predictive understanding of how certain kinds of people respond to certain kinds of music. Then we could get it right. So, if psychiatry is a part of the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex, wherein profit is a major motive, as some of my colleagues, I've just put in here together some arguments of colleagues of mine. So given my example about the music now and why I think power in the clinical trial experience or in the clinical therapeutic experience of psychedelics is a really an important factor, maybe not just power, maybe manipulation. Yeah? It's something we really need to keep in mind and be very aware of. So colleagues have been looking at this and thinking about the ways in which we can consider indigenous knowledges, in which we can actually think about how we get out of this profit motive or how this is problematic in this field. And then the question of how can we, do we need to, and is it inevitable, and it seems at this point to be, that these experiences individuals have in these settings are so reined in to fit an epistemic setting and a profit mechanisms of medicine that actually other things fall by the wayside. So what does it mean? And I talk about ethics and power. So now, of course, this is Freud. I had some slides at the beginning of my talk about critical theory and some key concepts, etc., but I've taken it out because I felt we can maybe, if you want to talk about this, we can. But it is really important that here, what we have is the patients are becoming somewhat passive exemplars. They exemplify their diagnosis and the type of person you want in your trial. And then they are recipients of whatever that protocol is. And in that sense, the sort of, in order to create mass market psychedelic psychotherapy, there is at this point no other way to do this. Huh? With the regulatory, the legal, and the other, and the scientific criteria that are in place. this is how it has to be. But ethics, as an ethicist and a critical theorist, the idea of people, well, for that matter, animals and plants becoming just passive exemplars is quite problematic. I do not use this lightly. I think this is the real problem here. Then there is, of course, the commodification of substances that becomes fetishes. So where the question is really, is it the psilocybin that does this to your brain scan? Or is it another drug in which dose that does this then to how your brain looks under this, that, or the other scanning tool? But as I tried to show, the music seems to be very important. We also know the therapeutic relationship and the integration process are very important. So this is not a drug protocol we are thinking of developing. And if that is not the case, then we need to think about the role of the substances and what else these substances could be other than within this very caged environment. And then, of course, in medicine, the value lies not in different worldview, in becoming wiser, or in learning anything. It just lies in overcoming your drug addiction, being less depressed, or whatever the definition was at the outset. So if there are any other of the uses that Osiris pointed out to us, they are not to be found in there. We need to be very aware of this. So what does an ethics of care then mean if we think about it differently? No playlists, no eye shades, no enforced passivity. That is not how a clinical trial can easily be run. There are some people trying this, at least with groups of people, maybe in the outdoors, but this is very difficult. How would you possibly define this so that you can get it into a treatment protocol? And this is part of the problem. If it was just about finding out how actually within people with mental health problems could possibly benefit from being given psychedelics, we could experiment freely if the drugs were illegal. And if we didn't have to prove to regulators that this is a profitable treatment that gets an FDA or MHRC or whatever approval and then can go through the healthcare system and be rolled out, etc. This whole apparatus of evidence production has nothing to do with the question of whether people with mental ill health could benefit from psychedelics. This is the way in which, however, medicine and psychology and psychiatry here are infused with other criteria on top of that very question of how can we actually maybe use this to make people who are like that feel significantly better? Because then we don't need to prove that this is the case for all people in the world with this particular diagnosis, or for all white bodies who like classical music within this world or something like this. We could just try it out wherever we are and check it, a bit more here, a bit more there. You could develop a sort of cleverness, maybe some wise woman or wise man ability to read a room in a setting, but instead what we get is this need to produce rigid protocol, and that is where I think it fails. So all this has to go out. We need a different way of working on this. So this is a nice quote I found, getting us back to the colonizing. According to Gebhard Selber, the shaman ascends to higher realms, where he listens to the melodies from the spirits and sings with them. These songs have a visual manifestation that the women transmit in their art. The Shipibo believe their bodies are covered by invisible designs. Illness is the disruption of the pattern, and the songs of the shaman restore their order and beauty. Healing is thus an aesthetic endeavor. The Shipibo believe their bodies are covered. I don't have to say twice. I'm sorry that I'm so while doing fieldwork in Santa Rosa, a Shipibo settlement at the Ucayali River, and that is with Eduardo Luna, of course, I asked Don Basilio Gordon, a shaman, about the plants used to heal his patients. He said that it is enough to know the song of the plants to be able to cure. The plants are needed only if you don't know their song. So you can do the singing once you got to the point that you knew the songs of the plants that you would need to heal that person. So we are sort of very, very much going crutches here. So coming back to the question of self-determination and liberty, can autochthonous healing of individuals in a community happen? if no one knows the actual song of the plants, if what we put in place instead is what I've been describing throughout this talk. So for different connections to the world outside us, a different choreography and sensory guidance might be necessary. If genuine new appreciation for nature, and this gets me to the nature connected state, is a desired outcome, then sensory encounters with the outside seem to be necessary, frankly. You can't lock people up in a room, lie them on a couch with eye shades and headphones. This is not how you can encounter nature. So this is what I call an alienation. It's a manipulation of the self in which the outside is made irrelevant. So the attention in the clinical trial, and I've quoted you from them to say that, is guided towards visualizations that are being produced from within the mind that the patient brings to that space. Yeah? There is no physical sensory encounters, touching or smelling anything differently than they would in their everyday life. They come in this and they go out in nature environment and in intersubjective environments, etc. experiences just as they came in. Because you have no actual engagement with anything that smells or tastes or looks beautiful. Think of Huxley's famous thing with the rose, or, but there has to be a rose. There is no rose in the setting we seem to wanting to provide. So the connectedness that then rises to nature and to the globe and to the cosmos is an imaginary connection. It is not on the ground of any actual experience, physically body, whole experience that the person has other than what they've already pre-configured. And here it is really important that the narrations and the psychedelic imagery, as Luis Eduardo told us, when his way in which he now critically reflects on the work he did with Pablo Amaringo and actually producing all this indigenous imagery, of which there's now so much kitsch, some of which we could admire at Breaking Convention. But actually, this is the imagery people have in their minds of what they might see. Yeah? And so this is what comes up. But how does this connect to our everyday life, to the actual environment we live in? So I think the emphasis on inner mental processes is really a problem, and it is reductive. It takes away from the ethical importance that maybe such experiences could have for people to change their lives and their attitudes to the world and the others they live in, because it's so fundamental. So the concerns with an ethics of decolonization then in this are moral culpability and compensation for past exploitations to indigenous people and other marginalized groups, and to think about inequalities and how we can prevent them from continuing. And it seems what we create in this clinical space is very much a continuum that just eclectically picks up stuff that it can fit in some way, in some distorted format, through the ringer of what we call science, this mango, into these protocols, not only not giving recognition, but actually probably having it distorted to a point of pointlessness. So the inequalities that exist continue, and we do nothing to prevent them. So there are new practices of colonization happening in the space, and we need to look at them. One aim we wrote in our article that we wrote together in the colonial group of decolonial ethics is to avoid unknowingly reifying insidious colonial logics in efforts to overcome that very power in the study of psychedelic practices, such as in places like Mexico and the Amazon. There is, however, also a structure of power within this medical setting, just within our own societies, where we are also colonizing the minds of people who come with maybe severely disturbed mental health and who are in trouble. Yeah? And what we offer them is something that is quite an imposition, one might say. And at least some people seem to clearly experience this like that. A decolonial ethics would be capable of creating new forms of relationality grounded in a different social ontology. And that includes relationality, as I just said, to the trees and the plants and the people you are in a room with, or maybe outdoors, to create other forms of experience, expanded consciousness rather than that. So I've been speaking about, from this graph some of you have seen before, I didn't speak much about the other things, just the yellow stuff. But of course, the synthetic reproduction that we are trying to do with we synthesize, or the standardization of the psychedelic treatment protocol is a process of synthesizing not only the drugs, but also the experiences themselves, of making them into a commodity that then we can dish out on prescription possibly. Yeah? And this is exactly the opposite of this idea of a wider consciousness or novel experiences of oneself and the world that we supposedly are aiming. So that's, I think, my last slide. So we need an ethics that thinks through these processes with the aim to, of course, for indigenous cultures and knowledge practices, for people, plants, and animals, but also for societies that are harmed by unaddressed colonizations, for individuals who suffer from mental health and those who don't, protecting the ineffable, that space that is not necessarily to become part of big databases in which everybody who's part of a trial reports exactly about their experience in the very format in which they are taught to, and in which we can then draw on these tens of thousands of trip reports to find out what. We only find out what we've put in as clusters. There is nothing to be found out. Some things might be left out of that clinical space, and they might much better thrive there. Then in for liberty and repairing these disordered relationships that I've mentioned, and for communities. And that is really thinking about these shifting powers that are enacted, where the psychological treatments with psychedelics are really part of this big medical pharmaco-industrial complex that aims to manipulate and control, and of course to profit from this as much as possible. If psychedelics are something alternate, of an alternate reality we could access, the chances that that is the way to go there, to me, seem zilch. So I think that is it. Yeah. Okay, so I'm here for questions, but we are both here for questions. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you a question about nausea.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking, first of all, when Osiris was talking about how they don't actually do experiments on, the sort of psilocybin mushrooms, or they extract what they see as the active ingredient, which then raised the question for me, well, first of all, do people get nauseous in these clinical trials, and how would they deal with that? But also in relationship to the kind of indigenous models, and again, I don't want to, sort of homogenize that, but a lot of these substances, whether it's psilocybin or morning glory seeds or yagi or whatever, like it makes you incredibly nauseous, right? And a lot of times, as a result of that, sort of the indigenous practices have to actually sort of, incorporate that into the healing. It's sort of, horrific vomiting is oftentimes actually part of the whole point of the process of being cured, right? So have they sort of somehow managed to get that out of these experiences, or do they still have to manage that somehow, and if so, how do they deal with that?
There are no trials, to my knowledge, with ayahuasca. And of course, Osiris said, nobody does trials with psilocybin either. Is there one now?
Well, there's the ones in Brazil that I was
Yeah.
the people in South Africa.
In South Africa. Luis Eduardo would not say, these Europeans are so bothered by a bit of vomit. What's the problem?
It's like, well, why go to all that trouble to sort of get rid of what a lot of people who use these substances think is actually an important part of the whole experience?
Well, you can see it as in the old medicine model as a sort of purification, yeah, getting rid of the stuff that you have surplus. But I mean, if you are lying on a couch with eyelids and headphones on, I'm not sure how much nausea is a problem, is it?
Yeah, we have nausea. Somebody would ask, but yeah, we definitely didn't frame it as a purging. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, but we will now.
As far as I know, psilocybin trials, they have very little nausea happen with it, and certainly from my experiential knowledge of seeing people using psilocybin mushrooms, it's very rare for people to feel nausea on those. So while they may do on ayahuasca and some of the other substances, psilocybin mushrooms don't make you feel sick. They might make you feel a bit old, but you very rarely actually feel sick. And it's the same with the trials. They have like a little container in case people feel nausea, but very few people do, and they feel ill rather than actually be ill or getting well from ayahuasca brain.
I think can you colonize people with decolonization?
I think you can. There's actually quite a lively debate about this, that this whole decolonized speech has taken over and we are colonizing the world with decolonization. that is an interesting discussion. And it depends very much on how you frame it. Yeah? If the aim of when I've used this term colonization very widely for all ways in which things are made to be appropriated by others for gains other than themselves, yeah? Or their own well-being. So Habermas spoke of the colonization of the life world, and with that he meant the way in which institutions of governance and law take over and actually undermine the opportunity for equal democratic discourse. Huh? So colonization in this very metaphorical use is something where decolonization is a way of speaking against particular forms of domination and power that are extractivist. And we of course see these everywhere. I mean, Facebook is a fantastic tool of colonization of everybody's life world.
It appears to be similar to what you were talking about, so it's with the whole like freedom for power, that paradox.
Yeah, this is unresolved, but if you don't speak about the power relations or the structures of domination that happen in this physical space, then you just pretend this is all easy. And I think there are a lot of problems within it that I wanted to point out.
But it seemed to me that you were positing that certain ontologies were superior to others, rather than saying like, oh, let's make space for all of them, let's make space for the synthetic psychedelics and the clinical space. You seem to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were saying, no, we need to be in nature, we need to be using the plant medicines over these forms, and isn't that somewhat
Actually, I'm not saying that at all.
hypocritical?
I can see how this may have reflected like that. But I think that there is an interesting way in which the proper Western use of psychedelics might just be take LSD. Because that's the kind of stuff we do. Yeah? That's what pharmaceutical companies develop. It's easy, it's cheap. You can it's actually in some way that would be more straightforward.
Yeah.
To use the synthetic lab-made chemicals that change people's minds.
Why not use all of them? All the 2C animals, all the different psilocybin animals. Why not draw upon full range?
Because they come really with a different epistemology, a different way of knowing. They elicit also other imageries. Yeah?
Okay.
We don't have a good phenomenology, and I'm not a great believer in making the brilliant phenomenology and what different people experience on different drugs, because I think this is actually so dependent, for example, on the order in which they started to experience these drugs. It's never just the drug.
Why place the emphasis on the ones that are used by the indigenous cultures rather than the plurality, I can't say that word, the plurality of all the different potentials?
Because indigenous peoples were the guardians of this knowledge for several centuries, right? If we are talking about therapeutic, use of psychedelics, is because the indigenous elders, kept the knowledge in a clandestine way, in spite of the fact of colonialism, right? For example, the historical source regarding psilocybin mushroom shows the archaeological evidence, the codices and manuscripts from 16th century, the ritual, the therapeutic, and even the hedonistic uses of psychedelics. But, for example, in the colonial archives, it is possible only to find 4 trials on psilocybin mushrooms. On the other hand, you find a lot of trials of peyote, right? And these knowledge were hidden for 4 centuries, 5 centuries, mainly by women, right? And we have to recognize this effort. Of course, I agree with Christine in the fact that from a Western perspective, LSD or synthetic mescaline will be a very useful tools. Why the psychedelic renaissance is not using LSD? Because the stigma, right? Because we are trying to overcome the counterculture of the 60s.
The time of it takes so long, it's too expensive to have a therapist for that many hours.
That is really
Yeah.
interesting. There's
Yeah.
a paper from
And
Gregory.
funny.
That's why we have 5-MeO DMT, because it's a free. I mean, this is such a choice of treatment pathway development with an eye to all the process through to regulation, through to health insurance reimbursement, and what the potential cost might be. That actually determines the research we are doing. And this is what I'm trying to point out, is so problematic.
Even now, for example, the goal is to reduce the time, to spend less money, the facilitators, therapists, and so on.
Sorry, just finish following what Rennie said. So do you see the synthetic psychedelics as less than their natural counterparts? Or do you think that's the wrong way to frame the question?
Well, no. I guess that the separation between natural and synthetic, it's also controversial, right? Both has different contradictions and paradoxes. But for example, in the case of peyote is an endangered species. For example, it's ethic, for example, to over-harvesting peyote to satisfy a spiritual need. Why don't use, for example, for other people, psychedelic tourists and so on, and synthetic mescaline, right? And before they criminalize, any plant, encourage the preservation of the plant. There are no programs of, growing peyote and avoid the over harvesting, But of course, you have to decriminalize and encourage, for example, the growing of peyote for 15 years at least. But in our psychedelic renaissance, time is money, right? And this is the way that it shaped the research.
I want to say something on this as well, but I think Ernesto wants to make a point first.
Yeah, I just want to say that synthetic stuff is not just about isolating the substance, it makes it patentable, right? So it's not just about this thing of making it synthetic or not.
And that's a different thing. One thing is to say, we try to extract what is the active ingredient in diet or in mushrooms and that. That's classical colonizing behavior. Yeah? The other thing is to say, we develop a drug in the laboratory that makes many people have certain kinds of experiences. It's very cheap, like this day. We can mass produce it, and it does something that is, it's not the appropriation necessarily. Of course, if it is modeled only to achieve what but it wasn't actually, historically it isn't. LSD is its own thing. It wasn't there to be an alternative to patented psilocybin. So there is a way in which you could argue that it's a pharmaceutically produced drug that fits exactly into the sort of science paradigm we live in. Why don't we work with that? Huh? Because that would avoid some of the colonizing aspects of the way in which currently this field moves forward. I think that is really important to realize that maybe we should just go and say, let's do work with the kind of stuff we do.
When you say then we were colonizing the hedonistic uses, experiences, you could be taking LSD on the underground, not on the underground train.
Then the mushrooms have, of course, been grown everywhere. And
They
it's an
were
interesting
kept
question of
in-
people in Europe or in ancient days did use mushrooms and had psychedelic experiences with them. So this question that we have not known about it anymore, after sort of hundreds and thousands of years of Christian purging of everything that was obscure or magical, is maybe no surprise. So this question of the mushroom is interesting in that and very different from yahe or ayahuasca because it is something that grows globally and
Yeah.
probably was a use here and there for this and that at some point globally.
Like the reason they are using cubensis, for example. The research, for example, it's not carried out on Psilocybe cerulensis, Psilocybe mexicana, Psilocybe aztecorum, Psilocybe mazatecorum, and so on and so on. But the reason they are using cubensis due to safety reasons. But also, for example, have you ever seen the prices of the Oregon treatment with psilocybin? $3,500 for 2 grams of psilocybin. You are not paying for the substance. You are paying for the therapies, the facilities, and so on. Which is the result of this? They are encouraging psychedelic tourists in Mexico with $3,500. You can live 6 months and have all the psychedelic experience that you want. You know, $3,500 for a session of 6 hours. They make it more expensive. Yeah.
Hi, first of all, that was really, really interesting. Thank you. And just to say, like you mentioned that randomized controlled trials are the golden standard of kind of like medical evidence, but I think this is slowly changing towards kind of like using more real world data. Would this be more, from an ethical viewpoint, more acceptable because people can do psychedelics on their own home the way they like, with the music they like, and then they could go somewhere and then there's some sort of like, I don't know, experience, either kind of like hard, kind of like quantitative stuff or even qualitative, just describe their experience, and someone could analyze this later. And with a lot of data, you could get some interesting insights perhaps on what works and what doesn't. And so the second part is just to drive away from the medicalization of this whole thing. Would perhaps help to use kind of like some more positive psychology type of kind of like outcomes. So kind of like more Seligman's positive traits instead of just using like depression, anxiety, and stuff like that. Because what we care really is whether these things make our lives better, rather than whether depression or anxiety, whatever this might be, is cured.
I mean, I'm not sure whether the drug alone would make the life better. But of course, all experiences we have in our life have an impact on our life. Some make it seriously worse, only for half a year or a year. Death, illness, things happen in people's lives. We have experiences all the time. And they affect how we are in the world now, some for longer, some for less long, some change you for the rest of your life. And psychedelic experiences for some people seem to be among the experiences that change them, that they perceive as so meaningful that they actually say that has seriously changed me. Other people don't, yeah? You can probably go to, I don't know how many raves, coming out exactly the same person throwing their litter in the park as you were before. There is a question in which, or not, you know, not all people are the same. So I think it's important that what I'm really trying to argue is, and I hope this became apparent, is that this idea that through medicalization, we can work against the stigmas and the laws that restrict, if not prohibit, radically access to psychedelic experiences, that this is the way to go. I think the opposite is the case. I think this is probably a way not to go. I think we probably should simply decriminalize the substances as they are not addictive, and there are so many things in our societies that do people harm. I'm not sure why we get stuck up on this things. And then try to educate people what this stuff is. But the ways in which, and that would allow them all sorts of real field experiments, and everybody could be their own field experiment, as we are with so many other things, whether we drink alcohol or smoke, whether we do this and that, which music we experiment with ourselves. That's what we do, and with the social environment we are in. But the scientific rigidity of the protocol, the need to have the diagnosis, which means including more vulnerable people in the first place, and then have measurable outcomes that then have to be priced before you even start because it has to be going through the NHS. This is just such a ballast that is more an obstacle than a tool for liberation.
Also a brief remark, for example, it's very important to highlight that the psychedelics are not magic bullets. right? And we have to take into account some social issues or social factors. For example, why the people is depressed. I was talking in Denver in psychedelic conference with a person of the University of Wisconsin-Madison who had a master program in pharmacology and so on and so on. And he answered me, oh, well, yes, you're right, but we were not solving the world of people. And I answered him, well, at least you have to take into account this social ontology, this social issues, and ask why people is depressed. Perhaps you are not able to solve, the life of the people, but at least, for example, in order to achieve more efficacy, try to include a social worker in the clinical trials. And he answered, oh, I never been thinking in that. Oh, yes, we will include a social worker. Why the people is depressed, right? Because poverty, lack of opportunities, trauma, and so on. Even if you are on the mainstream, to achieve more efficacy, you need to take into account, the social factor in order to explain why the people is depressed. The 10% of the worldwide population will be faced resistant depression. Why? And if we only consider that the psychedelic, the isolated substance will be the cure for everything, this is a naive perspective also. We have to take into account, the whole thing.
I mean, that was one of the things that really upset me at ICPR, when this question when asking why the post-traumatic stress syndrome patients that they treat, and this question, so what are these patients? And you look at the protocols, and a huge percentage of it is women suffering from sexual abuse and sexual violence. Yeah? And I mean, this was a long-standing argument 50 years old against psychiatry, that it's actually from the anti-psychiatrists, that it's actually always only coming to interfere with the few people who have. Many people have terrible experiences, a few absolutely even 2 years after can't cope. They then get a diagnosis and then they get treated. Yeah, but maybe we should need to look at what is with these other 80% who have not get treatment, but also were blocked in their life and maybe have long-term impact that just doesn't qualify for diagnosis or is differently described in their own mind to them as what their experience was. Maybe we should start thinking about preventing some of the experiences people seem to have that might be worth, at least as worth investing money in, than always thinking about how those who absolutely can't cope after a number of years, we can get them out of the deepest depths of their tongue so that they're functioning again. Just that, functioning, that's what we're asking for. Not happiness, not a fulfilled life. We just want them to no longer be addicted to drink, to no longer be unable to leave their house because they can't face anybody. So the expectations are so small. It really is important to start thinking about the wider whole, which is why this way in which, if alienation has something to do with the way people are mentally ill, then using something that in the process itself alienates them again seems to not be a very good way to deal with it.
Question maybe for Osiris on cognitive liberty and the intersection with the psychedelic experience there. So if psychedelics are as pharmacology for mental health, so it can be both a treatment and poison, does this also apply to processes of cognitive liberty in the sense that the increased susceptibility and the belief changes that we see can go in directions where people become more oriented and actually they're being controlled by an external source. And what is the key there to actually people having that cases in your view?
Well, it's a cognitive liberty related also with agency, right? And for example, if the psychedelic experience is capable to encourage and reinforce the agency, it's okay, right? In different ways, individual and collective, because it's not only an individual issue. You're right, it is not only an ego or egoist topic. In that sense, for example, if your individual freedom is compatible with collective freedom, that's okay. For example, but if the recognition of your freedom implies, for example, the denial of the freedom of other, this cognitive freedom, it's an illusion. For example, as Christine stated, for example, many patients in clinical trials are women suffering violence, right? And
I'm thinking more in terms of people that end up joining a cult or being controlled, so they lose their cognitive liberty in that respect.
well, it's controversial because with the use of psychedelics, you are at the borders. And at the same time, for example, psychedelics are or have a transformative capacity, but of course, only a person under the influence of psychedelic, it's very influential, right? And this is not this is not a common topic, And for example, as psychedelics could be seen as a tool of liberation, right? Psychedelics could be used as a tool of manipulation, right? And with the standardization of clinical trials and the opening of the market, for example, it is possible to achieve the colonization of the imagination, with all these standards and protocols and so on. For example, in Mexico, I used to give some courses for education, and I have hundreds of people in the WhatsApp group asking for this, and this is a standardization, the autodiagnosis. Hey, professor, teacher, and please recommend me a people who is working with. In Mexico, it's forbidden, right? Recommend me a people, who is working with the therapeutic purposes. And the people focus on the therapeutic purposes with the self-diagnosis. Okay, I make their own diagnosis, I need it, and then I will go with the therapist, with the mainstream or with the underground. It doesn't care. But this is a double-edged sword, right? It's a complex issue, but of course, a critical approach will be useful to overcome this internal medicalization, right?
Do you think
You don't need it.
that needs to be present or that can happen after the psychedelic experience to shift the outcome more towards the liberation rather than manipulation?
Well, not only after, because we tend to focus on the integration phase. By the reason at the beginning of my talk, I highlight the uses. Recognize the different uses of psychedelics. Of course, if you have a diagnosis and a therapeutic goal, it's possible to explore these situations. But if you don't, right? If you are using psychedelics for other different reasons, because the politics of prohibition also stigmatizes the pleasure. And it's a paradoxical sense that instead to recognize that I want to use psychedelics for pleasure, right? I try to justify for the stigma with an illness. I need the psychedelics because I need treatment, right? It's better to be a little bit more cynic and say it's for the pleasure, right? Instead of say, oh, I suffer, I am facing, a mental illness or a mental condition. Then I need psychedelics, and I put it on the way.
It's 5 o'clock, and we should really close. Ernesto, and then Celia, final word?
I just wanted to argue with this notion of agency and manipulation and free will. I think that's a wrong approach here. I really like Christine's approach of framing, right? If we start thinking agency in those very simplistic terms, there's no way out. And then if we think a little bit harder in terms of subjectivity, why people join a cult and they're being controlled, I don't think that's simple, right? You can say the same about religion, disciplines. So we need to nuance a lot more the agency debate here.
Yeah.
We're gonna do everything with that. Because if not, it's gonna be the tail question.
Well, there's some agency in deciding to actually see a therapist. This has usually been the criteria that you go to therapy because you are at a point in your life where you think this is the best way for you to move forward. So there's sort of the I don't think there is such a thing as a free mind. We are always guided by things, but we may have is the ability to choose the sort of regimes within which we operate. And of course, psychedelics at the moment, you either join a religion or you have a diagnosis. These are the only legitimate uses. And so this sort of is a core set of choices which we are problematizing. We think there needs to be more choice, but we also think there needs to be decriminalization.
Yes, for sure. And of course, liberty and freedom are controversial issues. Perhaps it is better to talk about technologies itself, right? There is not a kind of absolute freedom, right? The freedom has borders, and we choose inside these borders, right? And a finite being, it's not possible that a finite being achieve an absolute freedom. This is an utopia, right?
Not even a desirable one.
I was just another point, and I think you both alluded to it really, because yeah, I agree that medicalization of being involved in psychedelics is problematic. But to me, it seems like there's a broader problem. I think which you were acknowledging really is the medicalization of the pathologization of kind of human experience, poverty, social injustice, the things that we now call mental health, mental ill health. So that's the thing we should be challenging really, so we don't challenge that structure. And that's also culturally specific, isn't it? I don't think that's the same in Indigenous cultures, these notions of mental health and ill health in the same way that we have it.
It's fair, it's shame to have said that they don't know what to do with these tourists from the West. They can't understand their problems.
So is that what the students should be railing against rather than just the medicalization of psychedelics is the broader, the framework that gives people like this for the first place? Yeah.
We don't have enough time, but it will be, for example, interesting issues to address the cross-cultural character of illness. For example, Osiris Sinuhé, a Mazatec historian, in one of the symposia organized by Synaptis, one organization in Mexico, he stated, what happens if Maria Sabina knows that the sacred model will be useful to face post-traumatic stress syndrome? No? Or if you go to the clinic and say, oh, I lost my shadow. No? There are different sources of the illness, and for example, a cross-cultural psychiatry and a cross-cultural philosophy has to take into account these different worldviews and these different ontologies. Of course, it's a challenge. We don't have enough time, but it will be an interesting topic to develop and to address later.
David and Lucius, thank you for sticking with us. See you soon.